I had never been particularly picky about jobs. Bills needed to be paid, and my options were limited. That's how I ended up working in a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a massive, cold structure that looked abandoned even in broad daylight. When I saw the job listing, promising good pay for night shifts with minimal interaction, I thought it was perfect. I didn't mind being alone. I didn't mind the dark. I should have. The hiring process was surprisingly easy. Too easy. I applied online, received an invitation within an hour, and by the next evening, I was standing in front of the warehouse, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The man who greeted me was short and thin, his face pale and drawn as if he hadn't slept in weeks. His name tag read Ronald. "Welcome," he said in a monotone voice. "You're the new guy." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Yeah, just started." Ronald sighed and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to me without looking at my face. "Read this. Memorize it. Follow it exactly." I unfolded the paper, the dim yellow light from the entrance barely illuminating the typewritten words. Rules for the night shift. Always clock in by 9 p.m. sharp. Do not be late. Do not be early. If you hear someone calling your name from the storage aisles, ignore it. No one will ever need you that urgently. The lights in the eastern section may flicker. Do not attempt to fix them. Do not look at them for too long. If the back door opens on its own, close your eyes immediately and count to 30 before checking if it's shut. If you see someone who looks like you inside the warehouse, do not acknowledge them. Leave immediately and call Ronald. At exactly 3:15 a.m., take a 15-minute break in the break room. No matter what. Never enter the storage unit labeled 12-07. It doesn't exist. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. It will stop eventually. Leave by 6 a.m. No exceptions. I stared at the paper, feeling my heartbeat quicken. Is this a joke? Ronald didn't smile. You start now. The warehouse was even colder inside than it was outside. The air smelled of dust and old cardboard, the scent of forgotten things left too long in one place. The rows of towering shelves stretched into the darkness, their contents barely visible in the flickering overhead lights. Ronald led me to the time clock, where I punched in. Just follow the rules, he muttered, before turning and walking away. No good luck, no let me show you around. Just that ominous warning. For the first hour, nothing happened. I moved boxes, checked inventory, and tried to ignore the unsettling silence. The place was huge, much bigger than it seemed from the outside. I followed the numbered aisles, occasionally glancing at the list of rules taped inside my pocket. It was ridiculous. It had to be some kind of hazing ritual for new employees. Then I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, calling my name. Mark. I froze, my hands tightening around the clipboard I was holding. The voice came from aisle 7, deep in the storage section. My first instinct was to investigate, but then I remembered rule number 2. Ignore it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move on. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the concrete floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight. The voice didn't call out again. By midnight, I had almost convinced myself it was my imagination. The warehouse had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The way the shadows shifted under the weak fluorescent lights, the constant hum of the ventilation system, it could make anyone feel uneasy. Then the lights in the eastern section started to flicker. I had read rule number 3. Don't fix them. Don't look at them too long. But as I turned a corner, my gaze landed directly on them. The flickering bulbs cast strange, shifting shadows on the concrete floor. It was almost hypnotic. The longer I stared, the more the shadows seemed to move, like they had a life of their own. Shapes twisted and stretched, forming patterns that made no sense. Something moved in the periphery of my vision. I blinked and tore my gaze away, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows returned to normal. I took a shuddering breath and walked away as fast as I could without running. At 3:14 a.m., I remembered rule number 6. I had been so caught up in the eerie atmosphere that I had lost track of time. I hurried to the break room, throwing myself into one of the plastic chairs just as my watch ticked over to 3:15. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was from exertion, from working too hard. But deep down, I knew better. I counted down the minutes, refusing to look at the clock. Outside, in the vast emptiness of the warehouse, something shuffled along the aisles. Something heavy. Something slow. At 3:30 a.m., I forced myself to stand and return to work. By the time 6 a.m. rolled around, I had never been so eager to leave a place in my life. I punched out, stepping into the dawn's weak light with an overwhelming sense of relief. Ronald was waiting by the door, watching me with tired, sunken eyes. "You followed the rules," he said simply. I nodded. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want answers. I would be back the next night, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to be. The second night was worse. After the first shift, I told myself I was overreacting. The warehouse was just an eerie place at night, full of creaks and groans that could easily be mistaken for something sinister. The list of rules? Some kind of weird tradition meant to scare new employees. That was all. At least, that's what I kept repeating as I walked through the front doors at 8:55 p.m. Ronald was there again, sitting behind the front desk. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, then quickly returned to his clipboard. "Clock in," he muttered without preamble. I did as he said, the machine beeping softly as it registered my start time. 9 p.m. sharp. Ronald pushed a key across the counter toward me. "Stick to your routes. Don't get distracted." Something in his voice made me pause. Distracted by what? He let out a dry chuckle but didn't answer. Instead, he stood, stretched his arms, and headed toward the back door leading to the employee exit. "See you in the morning," he called over his shoulder. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the cavernous warehouse. The first hour was uneventful. I moved boxes from the receiving area to the designated storage aisles, checking numbers against my clipboard and doing my best to ignore the nagging feeling of being watched. Everything was fine until 10:30 p.m. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own movements bouncing off the concrete walls, but then they continued even when I stopped. Soft, deliberate steps coming from aisle 12. I froze. My first instinct was to call out, but rule number 2 echoed in my mind. If you hear someone calling your name from the storage aisles, ignore it. No one will ever need you that urgently. It didn't mention footsteps, though. I took a hesitant step forward, craning my neck to see around the corner of the towering shelves. The dim overhead lights cast long, eerie shadows between the rows of boxes, but there was nothing there. I waited, holding my breath. Silence. Maybe it had been my imagination after all. Shaking off my nerves, I turned back to my work, convincing myself that I was just tired. And then, at exactly 11:15 p.m., the lights in the eastern section started flickering again. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look away before the hypnotic flicker could take hold of me like last time. Don't fix them. Don't look too long. But as I turned my back on the faulty bulbs, I saw something else, movement in the farthest corner of the warehouse, near the restricted unit labeled 12-07. My stomach turned. That unit wasn't supposed to exist. I had memorized the layout of the warehouse the night before, tracing my routes in my head so I wouldn't get lost. There was no 12-07. But there it was, a metal storage door, slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. I took an involuntary step back. Then, from inside the unit, something knocked. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. I turned and walked away as fast as I could without running. By the time my break came at 3:15 a.m., my nerves were frayed. I locked myself in the break room, trying to steady my breathing. The vending machine hummed softly in the corner, the only source of sound in the suffocating silence. My hands shook as I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Just the time, 3:17 a.m. now. Something outside shifted. A low scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. I squeezed my eyes shut. 15 minutes. Stay inside. No matter what. The scraping noise stopped. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps, just like before, but this time, they were on the break room door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. At exactly 3:30 a.m., my alarm vibrated in my pocket. The knocking stopped. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Nothing else happened, but the feeling of unease never left me. By the time 6 a.m. arrived, I was exhausted. Ronald was waiting for me at the exit. He didn't say anything, just watched as I punched out. I hesitated, then finally asked, "Did anyone else hear anything last night?" He looked at me, his face unreadable. "You followed the rules," he said after a long pause. "That's what matters." Then he turned and walked away. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd be coming back for my next shift. By the third night, I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the warehouse itself or the rules I had been given. The list burned in my mind, each line a warning I could no longer ignore. I arrived at 8:58 p.m. The air was colder than the previous nights, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and refused to leave. Ronald was waiting for me at the front desk again, his fingers tapping against the clipboard in an anxious rhythm. "You're back," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a greeting, it was an observation. I nodded. "Yeah." Ronald studied me for a moment before sighing and handing over the key. "You followed the rules last night," he said. "That's good. Keep doing that. What happens if I don't?" I asked before I could stop myself. Ronald's fingers tensed around the clipboard. "Don't." Then, like every night before, he left me alone in the warehouse. The first half of my shift passed uneventfully. I worked quickly, moving boxes, checking inventory, doing my best to pretend I wasn't waiting for something to happen. But something always happened. At exactly 11:30 p.m., the footsteps started again. Soft. Measured. Moving along aisle 12, stopping when I stopped. I knew better than to look. I knew better than to acknowledge it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. That whatever was out there was getting bolder. Then, at 12:07 a.m., I heard the knock. It came from storage unit 12-07, the one that didn't exist. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I clenched my jaw and turned away. Do not acknowledge it. Do not investigate. Then my radio crackled. A voice whispered, "Mark." My breath hitched. I hadn't used the radio all night. The only other person with a radio was Ronald, and he had never spoken to me over it before. Another knock, louder this time. Then another. And another. The air in the warehouse seemed to grow heavier, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. My head throbbed. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "Mark," the radio repeated, the voice distorted, too low, too wrong. "Come closer." I turned off the radio. Then the lights in the eastern section started to flicker. At 3:15 a.m., I locked myself in the break room, my heart hammering in my chest. The rules had been clear, no matter what, take your break at 3:15 a.m. Something moved outside the door. A dragging sound. A whisper. I forced myself to stay put, gripping the edges of the table as the shadows under the door stretched unnaturally long. A low voice, almost amused, murmured, "Why do you hide?" I squeezed my eyes shut. 15 minutes. No matter what. At 3:30 a.m., my alarm vibrated against my wrist. The whispering stopped. The shadows receded. The air in the room felt lighter. I stood on shaking legs, pressing my ear against the door. Silence. When I stepped back onto the warehouse floor, nothing had changed. But I knew something had been there. And it had been waiting. At 5:45 a.m., I started counting down the minutes until I could leave. Then the back door opened on its own. A sharp, metallic creak echoed through the warehouse, sending a cold spike of fear through my spine. Rule number 4, if the back door opens on its own, close your eyes immediately and count to 30. I squeezed my eyes shut. 1, 2, 3. Something stepped inside. 4, 5, 6. The air turned freezing, the kind of cold that burned. 7, 8, 9. A presence loomed behind me, heavy and wrong. 10, 11, 12. The temperature dropped lower. My breath came out in ragged gasps. 13, 14, 15. The floor creaked. 16, 17, 18. It was right behind me. 19, 20, 21. My muscles locked in place. I couldn't move. 22, 23, 24. A whisper brushed against my ear. 25, 26, 27. My skin crawled. My stomach twisted. 28, 29, 30. I opened my eyes. The door was shut. The presence was gone. But my radio crackled again. "See you soon," it whispered. When I punched out at 6 a.m., Ronald was waiting by the door. He didn't say anything as I walked past him, but as I reached the exit, he muttered, "You lasted longer than most." I turned to face him. What happens to the ones who don't? Ronald didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't sure if I'd be back for another shift, but something told me I might not have a choice. The moment I stepped into the warehouse for my 4th shift, I felt it. Something had changed. The air was heavier, thick with an unspoken tension that wrapped around my throat like invisible fingers. The rules still rattled in my mind, but now they felt less like guidelines and more like desperate warnings. Ronald's usual nod of acknowledgement was absent. He barely glanced at me as I clocked in. His fingers tapped anxiously against his clipboard, a subtle but persistent rhythm that made my skin crawl. "You should have quit," he muttered under his breath. I hesitated, gripping the key he had slid across the counter. "Why?" Ronald exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "Because they've noticed you." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned on his heel and disappeared through the back door. By 10 p.m., I was already on edge. The warehouse felt different tonight, not just eerie but hostile, as if it resented my presence. The fluorescent lights above flickered more than usual, casting erratic shadows that made the stacks of boxes seem like lurking figures. At 10:42 p.m., I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow, darker than the others, standing just beyond the reach of the light at the end of aisle 7. I turned my head sharply, but it was gone. My heartbeat stuttered. I was starting to understand what Ronald meant. At 11:30 p.m., I heard the whispering. It started as a low murmur, just at the edge of hearing, impossible to make out. A trick of my mind, I told myself. An auditory hallucination from exhaustion. But then it grew louder, and it was saying my name. I gritted my teeth, focusing on my clipboard. If you hear someone calling your name from the storage aisles, ignore it. No one will ever need you that urgently. The whispering stopped. Then, from somewhere above me, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice, a slow, deliberate scraping, as if something was crawling along the rafters. I didn't look up. At 3:15 a.m., I locked myself in the break room, shaking. The rules said I had to stay here for 15 minutes. I had never been more grateful for a rule in my life. The vending machine hummed. The old fridge rattled. The air was stale but safe. Then the lights flickered. I sucked in a breath. The flickering lights had always been in the eastern section. Never here. Not in the break room. I glanced at the clock. 3:22 a.m. Just a few more minutes. A soft knock came from the other side of the door. 3 sharp raps. Deliberate. expectant. I swallowed. 15 minutes. No matter what. The knocking came again. Then a voice followed. "Mark, you forgot to check aisle 12. The voice was mine. I squeezed my eyes shut. 15 minutes. No matter what. At 3:30 a.m., my alarm buzzed. The knocking stopped. The voice was gone. I opened the door. The warehouse was silent. By 5:50 a.m., I was preparing to leave when I noticed something strange. The cameras, the ones mounted high in each corner, had all turned toward me. I had never seen them move before. I took a slow step back. The cameras followed. My radio crackled to life. I didn't touch it. Static. Then a voice. Low. Amused. "You see us now." I ran. At 6 a.m., I slammed my time card into the machine. My hands were shaking. Ronald was waiting at the door. He didn't look surprised. "They never do that," I said, my voice hoarse. The cameras. Ronald's expression was grim. "You should have quit." I stared at him, my breath unsteady. "Where are they?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not my place to say." The door buzzed as it unlocked. I stepped outside into the early morning light, my mind spinning with the implications of what I had just experienced. I wasn't sure if I could come back for another shift, but I had the sinking feeling that it wasn't up to me anymore. I didn't want to come back. Every rational part of me screamed to walk away, to quit, to disappear and never step foot inside that warehouse again. But I also knew, deep in my gut, that it wouldn't matter. I had seen too much. And now, they had seen me. Still, at 8:55 p.m., I was back in the building, staring at the flickering fluorescent lights and trying to convince myself that it was just another night. Just another shift. Ronald was there, of course. This time, he wasn't tapping his clipboard. He was gripping it, his knuckles white. "They're going to test you tonight," he said quietly. I felt my stomach drop. "Test me how?" His jaw tightened. "Just follow the rules. Even the ones that don't make sense." By 10 p.m., the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The cameras, the ones that had moved on their own last night, were all pointed at me again. No matter where I went, no matter which aisle I walked through, I could feel them tracking my movements. At 10:47 p.m., I made the mistake of looking up. There was something in the rafters. Not a shadow, not a trick of the flickering lights, something solid. Something with too many joints and limbs that bent the wrong way. It was clinging to the beams, its long fingers twitching as it watched me. I dropped my gaze immediately. Do not look at them directly. Do not acknowledge their presence. The rules had never mentioned anything in the rafters before. I swallowed hard and kept moving. At 11:15 p.m., the back door creaked open. I froze. If the back door opens on its own, close your eyes immediately and count to 30. I squeezed my eyes shut. Something stepped inside. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The air turned ice cold, and I heard something breathing. 4, 5, 6. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. 7, 8, 9. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and see what had come in, but I knew that was a mistake. 10, 11, 12. The footsteps stopped right in front of me. 13, 14, 15. The breath was at my ear now. 16, 17, 18. Something touched my arm. 19, 20, 21. I clenched my fists. 22, 23, 24. A whisper. A voice I didn't recognize. 25, 26, 27. My skin crawled. 28, 29, 8:30. I opened my eyes. The door was closed. The presence was gone, but I could still feel it, watching. At 3:15 a.m., I locked myself in the break room again. The 15 minutes stretched on for an eternity, but I knew better than to leave early. At 3:20 a.m., the vending machine turned off. That had never happened before. I checked my phone. No service. No time display. The numbers had disappeared. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. Then, in the silence, the fridge door creaked open. I didn't move. Something rustled inside, shifting the cans, knocking over a bottle. I gritted my teeth. 15 minutes. No matter what. Then the whisper came again. My voice. Mark, you forgot something in aisle 12. I squeezed my eyes shut. Ignore it. At 3:30 a.m., my phone vibrated. The lights flickered back on. The vending machine hummed to life. The fridge door was closed. I walked out without looking back. At 5:55 a.m., the cameras moved again. They weren't just watching now. They were guiding me, shifting their angles as if trying to direct my gaze somewhere. I refused to follow their lead. Then the radio crackled. Static. Then Ronald's voice, urgent and low. Mark, whatever you do, don't look at the ceiling. I felt my blood turn to ice. I wasn't sure what was worse, that Ronald was breaking protocol by using the radio, or that I had already broken the rule. Because I had looked. And now, whatever was up there, it knew. At 6 a.m., I clocked out with shaking hands. Ronald was at the door again, his face pale, his expression grim. You looked, didn't you? He asked. I couldn't bring myself to lie. I just nodded. Ronald exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. You need to quit, Mark. Before it's too late. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But somehow, I already knew that quitting wasn't an option anymore. They wouldn't let me go.